While Call of Duty 1 was enjoying a great deal of success on PC, Activision was keen to put their newly developed World War II themed franchise to consoles, where Medal of Honor was still king. After all, it was the early 2000s, and if you're not killing Nazis on your video game boxes on a Sunday morning, then what the hell are you even doing? Finest Hour is a fascinating game, with an even more fascinating story behind the scenes. We're gonna peel all the layers of this one, from the gameplay to the development to the drama at Activision, which ended up in court. Let's do the intro real quick. Spark Unlimited was the studio that was hired to bring Call of Duty to consoles. I'm sure a port of Call of Duty 1 with a slight downgrade would have worked for the Xbox and GameCube, but the undisputed leader in the console space at the time was the PlayStation 2, which was way less powerful than its competitors, so a direct port was out of the question. This would need to be a brand new game, designed with PlayStation 2 in mind. Its control scheme and system specifications would need to be at the core of the game's development. What this means is that Call of Duty Finest Hour is quite a different game than the original Call of Duty, and even though Finest Hour is sort of a spin-off, the similarities between the two don't really go much further than the game's title and the opening sequence.
Welcome to Stalingrad. You're about to begin the greatest moment of your life.
As you start the first mission, you might think, oh, this is just the same level as in the original Call of Duty, as the opening Stalingrad section does look quite familiar. But as soon as you progress past the riverbank, the mission goes in a completely different direction. There's a lot of dialogue here and cutscenes, there are more named characters, and while there really isn't that much depth to them, it at least gives me a slight reason to care about them. Unlike the many generically named Soviet commanders in Call of Duty 1 and 2. You meet this cool sniper lady fairly shortly in the game and help her out with securing some German fortified positions. And then you get to play a level with her, where you do some guerrilla type of stuff before making your way over to defend the last remaining tank factory in Stalingrad, where you participate in an exhilarating defense section, and towards the end of it, you protect a tank crew trying to reach you. And in the next level, you're driving that tank and doing a mission with the same sniper lady. This is already much more dynamic than Call of Duty 1. This structure of playable characters and levels that continue from each other was very welcome. I've never played Finest Hour before, so I didn't really know what to expect. I was guessing this was going to be a very cut down and simplified version of the original Call of Duty, but so far it's been far from it. This game was its own thing.
That armored column is a junkyard now.
It's not all perfect though. The game is an eyesore. The colors are all just shades of grey and brown. There are some later levels that looked a bit more colorful, but the missions in the Soviet campaign look downright ugly. Like, I get it, most of it's a war-torn city in rubbles, but still, some color here and there would have been nice. The weapon models are a different story though. I'd say these weapon models beat even the PC Call of Duty in quality. And when the player is looking at those hands and guns for 98% of the game's playtime, they better be some good-looking hands and guns. And speaking of guns, this selection is your standard World War II fare. There are some noticeable standouts, like the inclusion of heavy machine guns that you can fire on the go, but there's no SVT, no Sturmgewehr, no FG-42, and those are some of my favorites. I would have wished for more variety, but sometimes less is more, and sometimes more isn't really an option on PlayStation 2. What you need to understand is that FPS on consoles back then really wasn't such a staple as it is now. There's not a single PlayStation 2 FPS that controls fluidly, apart from maybe Black, but that came out nearly at the end of the PlayStation 2 lifetime. The controls were quirky and janky. Every game appeared to use a completely different layout. The stick sensitivity wasn't perfected by anyone up until this point. The players weren't used to it as much as we are nowadays, so developers had to work around this jank induced by the first-person perspective, as well as the limited compute power of the PlayStation 2, and the formula for a PlayStation 2 shooter had to be less is more. While I was playing the Finest Hour, the game felt nothing like Call of Duty, but it also didn't feel too unfamiliar. I just couldn't pinpoint why, and then it hit me. I've already played a very similar game, and it's the one I already showed you in this video, Medal of Honor Frontline. It kind of made sense now, as Spark Unlimited supposedly consisted of some developers that worked on Medal of Honor. Keyword here is supposedly. This is very juicy, but we'll get back to it later. Let's continue with the Soviet campaign for now.
Engine trouble?
Ganya, you and Alexander find some high ground. And
This
watch
is
for
a
the
tank
enemy.
mission, and it was very good. You can drive the tank in first-person mode from the viewport of the tank, but you can also switch to third-person. And not only that, you can also just take your gun out and pop up from the commander's hatch. This was very cool. A bit gimmicky since you'll be in this view most of the mission, but it's nice to go to third-person on longer drives without engagements. I love this tank part. There's actual context here to why you're suddenly in a tank, unlike in Call of Duty 1 and 2. You get to know this crew a bit and actually play as the commander for the remainder of the Soviet campaign. The meat of it is the actual tank combat, but throughout the levels you will also step out of the tank many times to go complete an objective on foot. This is so much more dynamic than the main games. And sure, you can argue that by the end of the Soviet campaign the tank overstays its welcome a bit. And yeah, it kind of does, but at least the game keeps spicing up the gameplay with unique and interesting objectives. The controls feel actually quite good, as the analog stick really helps with the movement in this case. The tank could be a little bit faster, and I wish it could plow through objects and buildings. But it is what it is. When I finished this part, I was pretty impressed by what I just played. This Soviet campaign was so much more fleshed out and interesting than COD 1 and COD 2. There were actual characters with backstories, dialogue, cutscenes, and the missions were quite varied. The sniper lady Tanya was very cool to see too. Even though the dialogue is very simple, it at least isn't as campy as Vanguard.
I shoot Nazis. They die. That's my plan.
Next up is the British campaign. And like in Call of Duty 1, here you're doing some special ops. You're part of a commando unit, Popski's private army, and you're tasked with taking out a fuel depot in Matmara, Tunisia, and neutralizing a nearby fort. This one really felt like a Medal of Honor mission, and I loved it. The desert here looks fantastic, and not one mission is the same as the one before. There's so much variety in objectives, locale, weapons you use. All along you're accompanied by a squad of fellow commandos, and also some African mercenaries if I understand correctly. Very cool stuff. It felt vastly different to the Soviet campaign and was even more cinematic. What makes this even better is the musical score. Finest Hour soundtrack is nothing short of amazing. It combines some tracks from Call of Duty 1, but it also includes many new ones, and these give each mission a different feel and atmosphere. Michael Giacchino returned for Finest Hour, and really gave it his finest. Unfortunately though, this would be his last Call of Duty title, and some of his last work in video games at all. At this point the guy landed a bunch of sweet TV and movie gigs, and left a hefty void in the gaming industry. Thank you sir for your work. Medal of Honor and Call of Duty wouldn't be the same without you. Up until now, it's safe to say I was having a blast with Finest Hour. The game seemed to address almost every piece of criticism I had for Call of Duty 1 and 2, like the unfinished levels for Warsaw and Stalingrad in COD 1, the scarcity of soundtrack through the levels, the non-existent story and characters, lack of context for some missions, namely the tank parts. All of this is addressed and improved upon in Finest Hour. Whereas the Soviet and British campaigns were exhilarating, tight, polished, the American campaign is a bit of a mixed bag. It's the longest of the bunch, and also more difficult. The story here is split in 3 parts. The capture of Aachen, the first German city to fall, the capture of a Belgian town of Tillet, and last but not least, the capture of the town of Remagen and its bridge, the last bridge left standing on River Rhine. The Aachen campaign was downright frustrating. The environments are bland and ugly, and the difficulty spike is substantial. I absolutely resented the escort mission, where you had to escort an M12 self-propelled artillery in a convoy with some Shermans through the town. The gameplay area here was very tight and limited and would consist of mostly just the width of the street you were on, which was kind of narrow at most times. The hordes of enemies would include a lot of Panzerschrecks that would target the M12 with no regard for their lives. The M12 has a health bar that you need to keep a track of. If the M12 dies, the mission is over and you go back to the start. The Panzerschrecks were so plentiful, and sometimes they would do like 75% of the damage as I'm trying to reload my Tommy gun. The checkpoints here were either very far apart or non-existent whatsoever. whatsoever. If the game felt like a breeze until now, this felt like a gauntlet for a final mission. Except it was not. This was a 60% mark in the playthrough, which made no sense. The game tries to vary it up a bit with different objectives, and you split off from the main convoy a couple of times. But this is mostly to go through this dreadful underground section that made me just wish it was over. British campaign was a high point, but this part just fell off a cliff. Is this the same symptom that Call of Duty 1 had? Maybe like lack of development time or funds? I went digging about the development of Finest Hour, and the more I dug, the weirder the story got. This game went through all kinds of development hell. The first major blow was the fact that Renderware engine got bought by EA by securing a deal with Criterion. Renderware at the time was the de facto engine for 3D games, not unlike Unreal is nowadays. This was a massive blow not only to Call of Duty Finest Hour, but many other games of the era. License fees would now have to be paid to EA, a direct competitor to most of these developers and publishers. This would be the first and last time Renderware would be used for a Call of Duty game. Now on to some really juicy stuff. Spark Unlimited had presented themselves as basically the studio behind Medal of Honor Frontline, while Activision was hiring a studio to do just that, make a Frontline counterpart to Call of Duty. The agreed upon budget for the game was to be $2 million, but in the end it was over $10 million. It seems Spark Unlimited bid way more than they could chew, and as the early 2004 deadline was approaching, Finest Hour was nowhere near finished. The game would release later in the fall thanks to assistance from Activision's other studios. They brought in Grey Matter Interactive, that previously worked on Return to Castle Wolfenstein and United Offensive. They would also bring in Treyarch, which would later take over the reins of console Call of Duty for the next few titles. Kuju Entertainment would also help mainly with multiplayer and the ports of the game. So in order for this fairly straightforward shooter with a campaign of 4 to 5 hours to come out, 4 studios had to work on it. Come to think of it, this does kind of sound like modern Call of Duty, but back to the point. Activision was furious, and they cut ties with the developers shortly after the game released. There was also a matter of the lawsuit between Electronic Arts and Spark. EA would accuse Spark of taking the company's secrets and go into competition, which is kind of exactly what they did. Activision would front up a substantial amount of money to cover the settlement for the lawsuit. Despite all that, Spark would later draft up a concept document for a sequel called Call of Duty Combined Forces, but Activision was having none of it. They quickly dismissed it, as the document read more like an expansion pack to Finest Hour rather than a proper sequel. And the story doesn't even stop here. In 2005, Spark would sue Activision. The lawsuit condemned the publisher and alleged they were intentionally trying to kill off the studio after they weren't able to secure a deal on the sequel. Activision would strike back with fury though. They would completely dismantle all of Spark's claims and throw in some more charges of their own. Activision was under the impression that Spark lied in regards to their expertise and ability to produce a Medal of Honor Frontline counterpart. Quote, misrepresentations were intended to deceive Activision into believing that Spark possessed the talent, knowledge, skill, and experience necessary to create a similarly successful new World War II game franchise that could rival Medal of Honor. Ouch! They would also accuse Spark of poor management, inability to port the game to Xbox and GameCube, which had to be done by other Activision studios. And also this part. I'm sorry, this is a really long quote, but this is so juicy. One might suppose Spark would have been overjoyed that, notwithstanding its repeated failures, it was getting a second chance to make a game with Activision. One might further suppose that Spark would have made an all-out effort to produce a knock-your-socks-off proposal that would contain not just a compelling sequel idea, but convincingly demonstrate that Spark had reformed and would not repeat its catastrophic performance on Finest Hour. One would suppose wrong. Activision had to practically beg Spark for a proposal, and when Spark finally delivered something weeks later, Spark provided a series of incomplete drafts that were so glaringly deficient in every material respect that it appears Spark provided them in bad faith, with the goal of having its proposal rejected. Yikes! Activision would also allege that the proposal for a sequel contained a lot of cut parts from the first game, which should have been done in their eyes, as it's already been paid for. But wait, there's more. Activision went further and accused Spark of not returning the development kits provided to them by Activision, which they are now using on other projects for other companies. They also went after the fact that they infringed on their trademark by having the Activision logo on Spark's website listed under partners. Jesus Christ, what a shit show. You can read the full article on GameSpot. I'll leave the link in the description below the video, but make sure to bring a glass of beer and some popcorn. This shit is almost better than the actual game. Okay, now I get it. How do I even segue back to the game review? Aachen was really bad. The Remagen part at the end redeemed the game for me, however. But first, what follows after Aachen is the assault on the town of Tillit in Belgium. You are now part of an all-black tank battalion, with a chip on their shoulders. These guys want to prove that they are the real deal, and honestly the story of this mission is great. What's not so great is the fact that once again, this is a tank level, and I kind of had enough of tanks in this game. Even the Soviet parts with the tanks were just on the verge of overstaying their welcome, so I was not excited to be back in a tank again. Thankfully, this one is relatively short, and there were some on-foot sections. The snowy landscape proved to be a nice change of scenery, and I really like this character and the story of the mission.
Everybody, no way the Nazis are gonna get supplied against Bastogne now.
Charlie Company, come in. Charlie Company, please respond.
This is Sergeant Rivers, Charlie Company, over.
Rivers, this is headquarters. Command, review enemy strength report and orders are to break off assault on Tillit. Do not go into that town, Sergeant. It's too hot in there.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm already through that town.
The final part of the game is once again back on track. The town of Remagen looks absolutely beautiful. The mission here is to scout and see if there's a minuscule chance that there's at least one bridge left intact over the Rhine River. Germans would destroy every bridge across it as they were retreating further into Germany in order to stop the Allies from advancing. After a couple of skirmishes through this very open level, you finally reach a view where you see the bridge is still intact. After calling your HQ with a shocking news, it's time to charge and take the bridge. This once again felt very Medal of Honor. The scenery, the level design, very frontline inspired. I especially liked the final assault and the mini gauntlet through these towers of the bridge. The level was not as difficult as Aachen, but proved to still be quite a challenge. Thankfully, it wasn't tedious or obnoxiously difficult. I'm in love with this scenery here. I wish Call of Duty 2 reimagined this in their engine with improved graphics. This would have been so much more epic than that generic last mission. The game ends on a high note, and as I was watching the credits, I realized that I actually really enjoyed this game despite all the negativity I just read about it with the lawsuits and development hell. Apart from the Aachen part, there was really nothing I disliked about the game. Quite contrary, I love the cutscenes, characters, varied objectives, set pieces, music. The gunplay of course is nowhere near Call of Duty on PC at the time, but it's serviceable. The movement speed could have been a bit quicker as I felt the character was just a tad too slow, and the graphics were a bit hit and miss. Some levels looked absolutely picturesque, some others not so much though. In the end, I was pleasantly surprised by Finest Hour. I really liked the fact that the game was not what I expected. Like I said before, I thought this was going to be a dumbed down and stripped down version of the PC game. But Finest Hour isn't really even Call of Duty. It's more Medal of Honor, which is a good thing, since Medal of Honor was amazing. Finest Hour in the end would prove to be a respectable entry to the console space. And I hear the following game is even better than this one. Thank you so much for watching. I wasn't planning on doing so many videos on classic Call of Duties, but man, these games pull you in. I'm dying to play the Big Red one, which I'm gonna do on stream, so come hang around, share some tips, some stories with us. Let us reminisce about the good old times. Let's be honest, we're all old farts here. Who the hell else would watch a video about Call of Duty Finest Hour? Hit the bell so you know when I go live or publish the next review. In the meantime though, feel free to check out my other videos. See you soon!